This slide highlights the objectives for the session today. I don't know if at the end of the session you'll be able to see that we completely met these objectives, which are quite ambitious for a 40-minute presentation. So the first objective is to introduce the process of translating basic research and clinical trial results into tangible societal benefits in the healthcare sector. The second objective is to learn the key steps and requirements for successfully entering the healthcare market with innovations. And the third objective is what is required for presenting research findings to relevant stakeholders and securing reimbursement for new treatments. So these are quite ambitious objectives, and I will try to scratch the surface so you have an idea of the three different aspects. So this slide is just briefly to let you know what I've been doing for the last 18 years. So in 2016, I founded the company named IMAC for short, and we shorten it for an obvious reason. And 4 years after, IMAC was established in Canada, and that was mainly due to our activities in the US. And I really like to think IMAC is unique in the fact that even though it's a smaller firm, which I call a human-scaled company, it is unique because it's global outreach, as we work with subject matters experts from various countries in the world. So we're a small company, but we have a global outreach. IMAC services the industry, the tech industry, medtech, meaning the medical device industry, the biotech companies, the pharma companies, the pharmaceutical companies, over the whole product life cycle to define, first of all, the market access strategy. And then from that strategy, we develop the tactical plan, and we can do that at the global and the local levels. And we also execute the plans we have developed for our clients. The next slide is the agenda for this session today. So first we'll go over the UK healthcare landscape. Then we'll introduce specifically the drug reimbursement landscape, which will lead us to some considerations for market authorization, and we'll try to tie it back to cirrhosis and GTAC. And I will close this session with some general recommendations and future outlook. The UK healthcare landscape, I picked one country because it's very difficult to go about this from a general perspective. So I used the UK as an example for the presentation. So let's begin this session by talking about the past 8 years in the UK. And we know that there have been 3 humongous events happening that really shook up the country and also the healthcare system, of course. First, we had the Brexit, when the UK decided to leave the EU in 2016. It caused a lot of uncertainty, of course, including in the healthcare system. Nobody was sure how it would affect things like medical supplies and the people working in our hospitals. And then in 2020, the COVID happened, COVID-19. It hit so hard. The healthcare system got completely slammed as hospitals filled up with people and very sick people. Doctors and nurses were working round the clock. So it really showed us where our healthcare system need to improve and how important it is to be ready for unexpected health crisis. And on top of all that, there's been tension in Eastern Europe and more recently in Israel, which could affect things globally, including our healthcare. So although the UK's economic outlook is strengthening and public finances have improved with a narrowing of the deficit, despite some negatives, the overall outlook for life sciences, healthcare, and the medtech sectors in the UK in 2024 is somewhat positive. The NHS, which is the National Health Service, is the umbrella term for the publicly funded healthcare system in the UK. It embodies three main principles of universality, equity, and accessibility. It's primarily funded by taxes, ensuring affordability at the point of service for most treatments. Everyone in the UK receives emergency and some mental health care. Regardless of residency status, you can get some mental health care. Through collaboration with the private sector, the NHS continues to adapt and evolve, although not fast enough, at least for technologies like medicines. And really, the idea is to ensure that the delivery of high quality healthcare services to all citizens, which is quite remarkable when you think about it. There are some countries in the world who would be very happy to live in a country where the healthcare system is such as the one in the UK. NHS is responsible for allocating funding to the clinical commissioning groups. It doesn't matter if you don't know what these are, but there are 211 of them all over the country. And then this is just to say that the funding trickles down from the national to the local level within this rather complicated structure. Now, you can imagine the number of stakeholders that are involved in managing budgets within the NHS. Now, the important part of this slide for our purposes today is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, which provides advice and guidance to the NHS at the national level. With regards to new therapies, NICE was set up by the government to decide which treatments are funded by the NHS. The aim is to make sure that people have the same access to treatment wherever they live and regardless of their wealth. NICE's main responsibility is to assess new drugs and treatments as they become available. The structure of NHS is ever evolving and so rapidly that perhaps even by the end of this presentation, this slide will be obsolete. Drug reimbursement is a crucial healthcare policy which impacts multiple stakeholders and influence various aspects of the system. The policies are vital for patient access and health outcomes and healthcare affordability and efficiency. It impacts multiple stakeholders, including the pharma biotech industry. And the overarching principle behind the drug reimbursement policies are ensuring patient access to essential medications, equity and fairness, obviously controlling healthcare costs, and promoting innovation in drug development. And last but not least, encouraging the appropriate use of medication. An introduction to the reimbursement UK landscape. Preparing for reimbursement success is crucial nowadays because regulatory approval alone will not be sufficient for patient access and a successful launch of a therapy in the UK. Once a clinical trial showed positive results, the next step is to obtain a regulatory approval from MHRA. Once the drug is approved, it can be commercialized, but market authorization does not mean yet that patients will have access to the therapy. If the new therapy is not funded by the NHS, meaning that patient would have to pay out of pocket for the drug, well, only the very wealthy patients would have access to the new state-of-the-art therapy. So in order to be successful as a company, the next step after regulatory approval is to obtain a positive recommendation by NICE and get funding by the NHS. MHRA and NICE will look at the new therapies such as GTAC and ask different questions. So as you may know, MHRA, which is the regulatory body in the UK, is concerned with efficacy, safety, and quality. On the other hand, NICE is concerned with clinical effectiveness, safety, and cost by way of looking at the cost effectiveness and drug budget impact. So essentially, MHRA and NICE are looking at the same technology, but from different angles. As an example, one of the questions that will be asked by the regulatory MHRA, obviously, is GTAC efficacious? So to answer these questions, the A-TANGO team designed this very sophisticated clinical trial, including a very specific patient population. The team came up with specific inclusion and inclusion criteria to make sure the right patients were included in the study to answer the question on efficacy. And on the other hand, the question asked by NICE will be, is GTAC effective compared to current clinical practice? Now, this question is extremely loaded when you try to answer it based on evidence. In essence, what the question means is, what type of patients will GTAC be used in the real world environment? Meaning, will the actual patients treated with GTAC in the real world be similar to those enrolled in the clinical trial? And if there is a difference, what is that difference? And how does this impact the efficacy outcome that were measured in this very controlled environment called the clinical trial? So I guess the point I'm trying to get across here is that NICE recommends to the NHS to fund a new therapy for all of the UK population in real time. This is real world and not clinical trial environment. And sometimes the real world conditions can be quite different from the clinical conditions. Another aspect that NICE will look at is the value of GTAC compared to current clinical practice. That aspect is not something that the MHRA or the regulatory agency is going to look at. So basically the question will be, what is the incremental cost effectiveness ratio of GTAC versus a comparator? So before we even get into the cost effectiveness, let's talk a little bit about the comparator that will be the comparator for GTAC in the eyes of NICE. Are these comparators the same as the ones included in the clinical trial? If not, what can you say about comparative effectiveness of GTAC? How can you prepare for ensuring that GTAC goes through the NICE HTS assessment rapidly so patient can benefit from the drug as soon as possible or as soon as you get regulatory approval, marketing approval? Well, the key to that is early strategic planning and payer engagement. You want to ensure alignment with the payers and other stakeholders. So the idea is to ensure that the requirements of payers or the requirements of NICE are taken into account very early in the planning of drug development. So when those clinical trials are designed, they align to fulfill the specific needs for the payer, of course, as much as possible, and in addition to fulfilling the requirements of the regulatory agencies. Okay, so maybe you will not be able to fulfill all the payer requirements in one clinical trial. And that's indeed quite possible. And we see that very often. But if you have identified the payer requirements for your therapy early enough, you will be able to anticipate what the gaps are, and you will be in a position to fill those gaps by generating the evidence required. Producing evidence is never an easy and fast process, so you can't get out of it. Early planning is the key to success in reimbursement. Now, I realize this slide is very busy and the idea is not to go through it in every detail, so have no fear. Speaking about early strategic planning and payer engagement, it's important to know that while the NICE appraisal remains the cornerstone of evidence-based decision-making, there are alternative access pathways playing a crucial role in facilitating timely access to promising interventions. The NHS intent by enabling flexibility and innovation in reimbursement processes is to ensure that patients have access to the treatments they need, even if NICE is facing uncertainty in their decision. They really recognize the urgency of addressing unmet medical needs, and alternative pathways have been established to facilitate timely access to promising interventions. These pathways often involve adaptive licensing, early access programs, or even conditional reimbursement schemes. And this allows patients to access treatments while further evidence is collected in order to reduce the uncertainty about the evidence of a product. So when it's time to go through the NICE evaluation, how does that work? Well, NICE follows a three-stage assessment process for new drugs: the scoping, the assessment, and the appraisal itself. So scoping determines specific questions to address, like we discussed before, which diseases and patient groups to consider and which existing drugs to compare the new drug against. Once this is all established and everybody is on the same page, NICE, the companies, and all the other stakeholders involved in scoping the project, the assessment can go on. The assessment evaluates the clinical and the cost-effectiveness evidence of a drug. Once the assessment is done, then the appraisal committee decides whether the NHS should fund the new drug, considering factors like the strength of the clinical evidence, patient clinical needs, cost effectiveness, and the robustness of the economic evaluation and budget impact. Now, there are 5 possible outcomes coming out of an appraisal. An intervention can be classified as either recommended or not recommended, and there are 3 possibilities in between: optimized, recommended for use, and recommended for use in the CDF and IMF, and the only for research category. So recommended means this is good news. The drug is recommended for use in line with the marketing authorization. The optimized category means that the technology is recommended for a smaller group of patients than originally stated in the marketing authorization. And I have to say that this is probably the most common type of categorization that I have seen so far in my career. Sometimes, and many times, the committee decides that a drug is only cost effective in a specific group of people. For example, people who are resistant to or can't tolerate other drugs. And then the other category is recommended for use in the CDF or IMF, which are the cancer drugs and innovative medicine funds. These types of recommendation refer to the inclusion for funding of a particular intervention for cancer or across a broader spectrum of conditions that have not yet been approved by NICE or are being used off-label, but NICE realizes that access has to be given to some of those patients, even though it hasn't been accepted yet. That means there is early evidence that a drug has clinical benefits, but still need more evidence to prove its cost effectiveness. And for patients, this means early access to innovation. And for companies, it means earlier revenue generation. Now, the last category is only for research. The drug or treatment is recommended for use only in the context of research, like a clinical trial. You may have heard that cost effectiveness evaluation is a key consideration in NICE decision making. Indeed, NICE considers ICER thresholds needing to be met for a positive recommendation. NICE uses quality adjusted life years, the famous QALY, gained to calculate an ICER ratio. And that helps determine the value of the new drug in terms of health benefits and cost. So the end result of a cost effectiveness analysis, which may seem very, very complicated, is a cost per QALY. And this is for any drugs evaluated by NICE or any technology evaluated by NICE. With this approach, NICE is able to make consistent funding decisions across various technology, clinical areas, patient groups, considering the opportunity cost of funding one intervention over the other. So in general, NICE has established many years ago that an ICER of £30,000 per QALY was the threshold that would determine if your drug is cost effective or not. So if your drug is higher, if the ICER of your drug is higher than £30 per QALY, then your drug is considered not cost effective. If it is £30 per QALY and below, it is considered as cost effective. So when you look at the equation for the ICER, it becomes quite intuitive to think that pricing of the new therapy will have one big role to play in determining the ICER of a new drug. Now, over time, things have evolved with the advancement of innovations made available by the industry, the emergence of new therapies such as innovations for very small groups of patients like orphan diseases, like gene and cell therapies are very costly innovations. Hence, they have a very high ICER. And this has forced NICE to consider the nuances of ICER thresholds associated with different types of technology. And all of this is in the aim of optimizing access, meaning getting access to patients to more and more new technology, and of course, resource allocation within the healthcare system. So currently, NICE conducts various types of technology appraisals to help improve access to treatments. Each are associated to different ICER thresholds. So they have evolved from the £30,000 per QALY to different ICERs for different types of technology appraisals. So there are 4 different types of appraisals that we know about to date. The single technology fast track, multiple technology, and the highly specialized technology. And again, the goal here is not to retain all this information, and it's just to know that this exists, and you can find detailed information about these topics very easily online. So to name a few, single technology appraisal, which focus on one medical technology compared to currently used alternative. The standard threshold is between 20,000 pounds to 30,000 pounds per quality. Now, if you look on the other hand, the highly specialized technology appraisal evaluates treatments for rare diseases. It would consider an ICER of 100,000 pounds per quality as the standard threshold. And this threshold is higher to account for the high cost of the medication and also the fact that this type of technology is offered for a limited patient population. Now, considerations for commercialization. As we have covered, the reimbursement landscape is evolving ever so rapidly, with the companies requiring innovative strategies to fulfill the payer requirements. And NICE sets very tough cost effectiveness standards, making access difficult for costly treatments. So the key challenge in the UK, and this is probably true in many other countries in Europe and even around the world, budget constraints means that NHS prioritizes treatments offering the most value, meaning having better ICERs, which can make access challenging for high-cost treatments. And there is a real push towards value-based pricing, which really requires to link the price of a treatment to its value to patients and the healthcare system. Increasingly, reimbursement decisions are being influenced by real-world evidence or effectiveness data outside of clinical trials, as we talked about earlier. Generating real-world data adds to the cost and complexity of drug development. Companies need to invest in proving treatment effectiveness outside of clinical trials to fill the evidence required by payers. And the fact is that the reimbursement system has been very slow to adapt to advancements such as, those cell and gene therapies and treatment for rare diseases in general. And this has caused delays in patient access to new treatments and has also caused delays in revenue generating by companies. The challenges are even greater for combination therapies to reach the required cost effectiveness threshold to obtain a positive recommendation from NICE. GTAC is a combination therapy, and this is going to be a challenge. NICE uses the same appraisal framework as for individual medicine. So in some instances, we have seen where a combination therapy can be not cost effective, even if one of the two components of the combination was priced at £0. So definitely the framework that exists right now is not suitable for combination therapy. So something has to be done about that. There are potential solutions that are being explored right now with various stakeholders and with the inclusion of the industry. The industry is involved, but there's nothing really concrete right now as we speak as a worthwhile solution to discuss today. So the last section is about recommendations and future outlook. I guess you were going to guess at this point that I was going to say early strategic planning is definitely the way to go to obtain early reimbursement for your technology. First of all, early engagement with regulatory bodies is something that drug developers are really good at, and they should continue to do that. but they really need to include as well early engagement of reimbursement bodies and other stakeholders as well, even as early as when you plan your drug development. Companies are also very good at generating robust clinical evidence, and they need to ensure now that they also generate robust economic evidence in order to get reimbursement by the NHS. One thing that's also very important and will increase in importance is the patient voice. Now, patients have a formal way of inputting in the NICE decisions. So patients need support, they need education, they need tools to be able to communicate with the reimbursement body as to their needs. And this is something that the industry can help with. Now, another thing that you should be ready in advance is for your pricing and reimbursement negotiations. These negotiations are tough, and it's very important to elaborate different scenarios way in advance and actually strategize about these different scenarios, because you don't want to end up the day of your negotiation trying to figure out what is the bottom price that you will accept, because it becomes really complicated. So thinking about that very early on and tying this as well to the robustness of your evidence is key. And also one thing that's very important, once you've gone through all this process and you obtained reimbursement, it's important to maintain your market access strategy post reimbursement. This is a very dynamic area. Drugs keep being introduced in the market. Some drugs exit the market. There's new evolving environment. So it's very important to keep your market access strategy up to date. So that's it for me. Thank you.